Mason and Riley were Birmingham's most feared enforcers, men who collected debts with fists and fire. But one night, a routine job in Manchester turned into a deadly trap, leaving them burnt, buried, and erased from the streets forever. This is the story of how fear became their enemy, and the underworld paid them back in fire and blood. In the late 2000s, Birmingham was a city caught in the grip of organized crime. Away from the shopping streets and new developments, entire estates lived under the shadow of drug gangs, debt collectors, and violent rivalries. In this world, two names began to carry weight: Mason and Riley. They weren't bosses, they weren't flashy dealers, but they were feared more than many who held higher ranks. Their trade was fear itself. They made a living out of pain, intimidation, and the unspoken promise that nobody could escape a debt. Mason, tall and built like a fighter, had grown up in a home where violence was normal. He learned early that fists could solve problems faster than words. Riley, on the other hand, was quieter, calculating, and colder. Together they balanced each other, brute force and sharp thinking, a pairing that made them dangerous. By their mid-20s, both had already served time in prison. But inside jail, their reputations only grew stronger. When they came out, gangs saw them not as wasted men but as valuable assets. Their work began with small jobs, collecting a few £100s from a low-level dealer who had dipped into his own supply, smashing up a car belonging to someone who missed payments, standing in the background as silent reminders of what would happen if debts were ignored. But as their names spread, so did the size of their tasks. Soon they weren't dealing with petty criminals. They were standing face to face with men moving kilos of cocaine, heroin, and cannabis through the Midlands. Mason and Riley weren't afraid. They thrived on the danger. The more violent the job, the more respected they became. In the world of gangland crime, violence is as much about theater as punishment. Mason and Riley understood this perfectly. They knew that breaking one man's arm in public sent a message to dozens of others. They weren't reckless, but they weren't merciful either. Stories began to circulate of Riley forcing someone's head into a deep fryer at a takeaway shop over an unpaid debt, of Mason dragging a man out of his home in front of his children and beating him until his jaw shattered. Whether all of the tales were true didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed them. Their reputation stretched beyond Birmingham. Dealers in Wolverhampton, Coventry, and even Manchester knew who they were. They worked mainly for Callum Doyle, a rising gang boss who saw them as his personal weapons. Doyle didn't need to shout or threaten. He had Mason and Riley to do that for him. For years the arrangement worked. The enforcers got paid handsomely and lived with a freedom that many criminals only dreamed of. They had no need to manage drug shipments, no need to deal with police surveillance or court cases involving supply. Their role was simpler, but it carried its own risks. Every debt they collected tightened their bond with Doyle, but also painted targets on their backs. Rivals saw them not as men, but as obstacles, barriers between debtors and survival. Mason and Riley believed they were untouchable, that their fearsome image was enough to protect them. But in the underworld, respect and fear are fragile shields. One wrong step, one miscalculated move, and even the most feared enforcers can fall into the fire. Callum Doyle was not the kind of man who forgave mistakes. By the time he hit his early 30s, he controlled a wide slice of Birmingham's cocaine trade and had the arrogance that came with fast money. He relied on a network of trusted dealers spread across the Midlands and up into Manchester. Every shipment he moved had a clear chain: product in, money back out. It was a system built on trust, but it was also built on fear. When one part of the chain broke, Doyle made sure the message was loud and brutal. That chain snapped when a Manchester dealer named Fletcher disappeared with a fortune. The deal had been simple. Doyle fronted Fletcher with cocaine worth close to £500,000. Fletcher was supposed to sell it, pay Doyle his cut, and keep a smaller share for himself. But Fletcher had other ideas. He sold everything, paid off some of his own debts to a rival crew, and then went quiet. To Doyle, This wasn't just a financial loss. It was an insult, a challenge to his authority. If word spread that a dealer could simply walk away without paying, others might try the same. That could destroy him. Doyle called Mason and Riley to his safe house. He didn't shout or wave his arms. He didn't need to. The two men understood immediately what was expected. Fletcher was not just to be reminded. He was to be made an example of. Doyle's instructions were simple. Bring him back alive if possible. Bring the money if it still existed, but above all make sure nobody else thought about crossing him. For Mason and Riley, this was routine. They had done it before. Dealers went missing all the time, and when they reappeared, they usually carried broken bones and missing teeth. But this time was different. Fletcher hadn't simply run. He had paid protection money to a cartel-backed crew in Manchester, men who had connections that stretched far beyond Doyle's world. Mason and Riley didn't know this when they set out. They only knew Fletcher had vanished, and they intended to drag him back no matter what. Their confidence was unshakable. For years fear had been their weapon, and they assumed it would work again. They spent days hunting Fletcher, knocking on doors, questioning anyone who might know his whereabouts. Mason was the more aggressive, throwing threats around like weapons. Riley played the quieter role, listening, piecing together scraps of information. Eventually, they tracked Fletcher to a rundown flat in Salford. What they didn't see was the net closing around them. Every question they asked, every door they kicked in, was reported back to the crew protecting Fletcher. The two enforcers thought they were circling prey, but in reality, they were walking into a trap. Doyle had promised them extra cash if they pulled this off quickly. That promise gave them urgency, made them reckless. They stormed into Salford believing the debt was theirs to collect, that Fletcher was just another frightened dealer. What they failed to realize was that Fletcher's debt had already been claimed by others, and in the criminal world, there is no such thing as paying twice. Someone would have to pay in blood, and Mason and Riley had just volunteered themselves. Mason and Riley prided themselves on never backing down. By the time they reached Salford, they were certain they had Fletcher cornered. They kicked in the door of the flat with the confidence of men who had done it countless times before. Inside, they found little more than an empty mattress, some half-burnt cigarettes, and a few scraps of takeaway boxes. Fletcher was already gone. What Mason and Riley didn't realize was that Fletcher hadn't just moved on his own. He had been warned, carefully shielded, and moved to safety by the very men who now had them under watch. Their search for him had not gone unnoticed. It had been allowed, even encouraged, as part of a wider plan to lure them deeper. For Doyle's enforcers, the trip to Manchester was supposed to be about control. They thought they were sending a message that debts could never be ignored. But on the streets of Salford and Moss Side, the message was received differently. The crew backing Fletcher saw the intrusion as disrespect. Doyle's men had crossed into their territory, waving their fists and making threats, and that could not be tolerated. It was no longer about Fletcher or the missing $500,000. It was about pride, territory, and the kind of silent rules that governed the underworld. By ignoring those rules, Mason and Riley had declared a war they weren't prepared for. The first real warning came 2 nights later. Mason's car, parked outside a friend's house, went up in flames. He assumed it was random, maybe local kids messing around. Riley wasn't so sure. Then came the second message. A contact they relied on in Manchester suddenly stopped answering calls. Another man they leaned on for information disappeared overnight. His flat cleared out in a hurry. Mason dismissed it all as noise, convinced that if they kept pushing, Fletcher would have no choice but to surface. Riley began to sense the shift. He noticed cars following them, saw the same faces watching from across pubs, and felt the tension in every alley they walked down. The hunter's confidence was slipping, replaced by the uneasy realization that they had become prey. But fear didn't stop them. It never had. Instead, Mason doubled down. He stormed into pubs, slapped men across the face for refusing to talk, and threatened to burn down homes. Each act of violence only drew them deeper into the rival crew's spotlight. Behind the scenes, Fletcher's protectors were already planning how to deal with them. It wasn't enough to warn them off. These two needed to be erased in a way that would send a message louder than any broken jaw. By the end of the week, whispers had reached Doyle himself. Some of his own contacts told him to pull Mason and Riley out before things got worse. But Doyle was stubborn. He told them to finish the job, to get Fletcher or the money, no matter what. That decision sealed their fate. Mason and Riley believed their reputation could carry them through, but in Manchester, reputation counted for nothing against a crew with cartel connections. Their mistake wasn't in chasing Fletcher, it was in underestimating the men standing behind him. And once those men made up their minds, the end was already written. The call came late one evening. Mason answered it with the same rough confidence he carried into every situation. A man on the other end said he had information about Fletcher, about the missing money, and about where the debt could finally be collected. The voice was calm, steady, and convincing. It was the kind of call Mason had been waiting for. To him it sounded like the break they needed, the chance to wrap things up and bring Doyle what he wanted. Riley listened from the other side of the room, skeptical but unwilling to back down. The caller gave them a location, an old scrapyard on the edge of Manchester. He told them to come at night when no one would be around, and promised that Fletcher would be there. For men like Mason and Riley, this wasn't unusual. Meetings in dark, forgotten places were part of the job. Secluded spots meant fewer witnesses, fewer risks of police involvement, and more space to make someone disappear. They drove into the night with little more than crowbars and blades, sure that intimidation would be enough. The scrapyard loomed in the distance, its broken gates creaking in the wind, the skeletons of old cars piled high like monuments to rust and decay. The air smelled of oil and damp metal, a fitting stage for what they thought would be another routine job. As they stepped inside, silence pressed down on them. The yard was too quiet. No dogs barked, no guards shouted, just the sound of gravel crunching under their boots. Riley felt the unease immediately. Something didn't add up. He scanned the shadows, his eyes darting between heaps of wrecked cars and hollowed vans. Mason ignored the tension. He walked forward with the swagger of a man who believed nobody could touch him. They had built their entire lives on that kind of confidence. And tonight, Mason carried it like armor. The deeper they moved into the scrapyard, the more obvious it became that they weren't alone. Shapes flickered in the darkness, movements too quick to be explained by the wind. Riley whispered that they should pull back, but Mason kept walking, gripping his crowbar tighter. Then came the sound, metal slamming against metal, the scrapyard gate shutting behind them. The noise echoed through the night like a death knell. Riley spun around, realizing too late that their only way out had been sealed. From the shadows, figures emerged. Masks covered their faces, gloves hid their fingerprints, and each carried weapons designed for one purpose. Mason and Riley were surrounded before they could even react. Their instincts kicked in, and Mason charged at the nearest figure, swinging wildly, his crowbar connecting with a sickening thud. Riley backed up, fists raised, but there were too many. The ambush was precise, ruthless, and overwhelming. Every movement had been planned. Every step Mason and Riley had taken into the scrapyard had been guided by unseen hands. The trap was complete. The two feared enforcers who had spent years hunting others now realized they were the hunted. The silence of the scrapyard was broken by the clash of violence, the sound of fists and weapons striking flesh, and the cruel laughter of men who knew they had control. What Mason and Riley thought was their opportunity to prove loyalty to Doyle was, in fact, their walk into a carefully prepared grave. The chaos in the scrapyard was complete. Mason swung wildly, his crowbar cracking against metal and bone, but the attackers were too many and too coordinated. Riley fought beside him, fists and kicks thrown with precision, but it was already too late. Every angle had been covered. The enforcers who had spent years intimidating others were now at the mercy of men who had prepared for their arrival. The air was filled with the sharp metallic scent of blood, mixed with the acrid tang of burnt oil and rust. a sensory assault that made the violence even more brutal. Mason's first assailant drove a knee into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled, barely able to lift his crowbar, as another masked figure struck him across the ribs with a metal pipe. Riley tried to grab one of the attackers, swinging wildly, but a gloved hand caught his wrist and twisted until he dropped to the ground with a painful crack. They were pinned, outnumbered, and exhausted. The scrapyard, which had seemed like an ordinary meeting place moments before, had transformed into a cage of terror, a stage for the punishment that awaited them. The attackers were methodical. They didn't just want to hurt Mason and Riley. They wanted to make an example of them. Each strike was calculated. Each movement meant to instill fear. Mason landed a few hits, breaking noses and cutting faces, but the odds were against him. Riley's fists connected with ribs and jawlines, leaving bruises on bodies far larger than their own, but for every blow they landed, two more came back. The night air was filled with the sounds of grunts, metal clashing, and muffled cries, the brutality heightened by the desolate emptiness of the scrapyard around them. When Mason and Riley were finally restrained, tied roughly with thick ropes and dragged toward the back of the yard, the fear they had inspired in countless victims returned to them in full force. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted, and the lesson had already begun. Petrol was poured over them, the liquid soaking into clothing and hair, seeping into the cracks of their skin where bruises already formed. The smell was overwhelming, a warning of what was about to come. Mason struggled against the ropes, his strength failing him, and Riley's shouts were silenced by a cloth pressed to his mouth. The moment of fire was sudden and terrifying. A single match ignited the petrol, and flames erupted, curling around their bodies with blistering speed. Mason screamed as the heat engulfed him, the fire consuming the flesh of his arms and face, the smoke burning his lungs. Riley thrashed desperately, trying to roll away, but the ropes held him fast. The masked attackers stood back, watching, unflinching, as the two enforcers writhed in agony. In a matter of minutes, both men were reduced to screaming silhouettes, the fire marking the end of two lives built on fear and violence. As the flames died down, the attackers left no evidence behind, save for the scorched ground and the faint smell of burnt flesh lingering in the cold night air. Mason and Riley were gone, their bodies charred beyond recognition. The scrapyard returned to silence, the kind that comes after something horrific, a quiet reminder that even the most feared enforcers could be destroyed when the wrong people decided to act. By dawn, the scrapyard was eerily silent. The night's violence had vanished as though it had never happened, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and burnt oil. Mason and Riley's bodies, reduced to charred remnants, were no longer visible to anyone passing by. Their killers had worked efficiently, dragging the remains to a shallow grave hidden beneath piles of concrete rubble and broken car parts. The grave was hastily but meticulously covered, designed to blend seamlessly with the wreckage around it. To an untrained eye, it looked like part of the scrapyard's usual mess: discarded engines, twisted metal, and rusting vehicles. But beneath lay the two enforcers who had once struck terror across the Midlands. The killers didn't linger. They vanished into the night, leaving no footprints, no discarded weapons, and no witnesses. In the criminal world, precision and silence were as valuable as firepower, and this operation had been executed with both. The message was clear: even the most feared enforcers could be taken out if they underestimated those they crossed. The scrapyard, once a forgotten corner of Manchester, had been transformed into a secret memorial for a warning that only those who understood the rules of the underworld would ever see. Back in Birmingham, Doyle's network waited for news. Days passed, but Mason and Riley never returned. Calls went unanswered, and their phones pinged with nothing but dead lines. The gang boss grew uneasy, but his pride prevented him from acting too quickly. In his mind, Mason and Riley were capable of handling themselves. They had survived worse. The absence, however, began to gnaw at the edges of his confidence. Rumors trickled back through various contacts, whispers of a violent trap in Manchester, hints that someone had acted against the enforcers. Doyle ignored most of it, unwilling to believe that his trusted men could have been outmatched. Meanwhile, the scrapyard remained untouched, a silent witness to the grisly events that had occurred. Employees from nearby workshops spoke of the strange quiet that hung over the area, the kind that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. Locals avoided the place at night, sensing a darkness they could not explain. Those in the underworld who knew the story didn't speak of it openly. Fear had ensured their silence. Even rumors were couched in caution, shared only with trusted allies and in hushed tones. The lesson Mason and Riley left behind was more powerful than any of their violent acts during their lives. Power can vanish in an instant, and reputation is fragile. Law enforcement eventually received anonymous tips, suggesting that something had happened to Doyle's enforcers in Manchester. Investigators arrived, combed the scrapyard, and found traces of burned material, but no human remains. Without bodies, there was no murder case, no legal path to justice. The killers had erased almost every trace, leaving only the memory of the enforcers' fearsome presence and the chilling story of how even the strongest can be brought down. In the weeks that followed, Mason and Riley's absence reshaped Doyle's operations. Other enforcers became cautious, hesitant to act with the same ruthless confidence. The balance of power shifted quietly but decisively. Their disappearance left a vacuum in the Midlands' criminal underworld, one that rival gangs and ambitious criminals were quick to notice. The burned and buried enforcers had become legends, their fate a whispered reminder that in Gangland, loyalty, strength, and fear could all be extinguished in a single night, leaving only silence and the shadow of what once was. Rumors of Mason and Riley's fate spread quickly through Birmingham and Manchester. In the criminal underworld, information moved faster than any police report, carried in whispers and wary glances. People speculated endlessly. Some believed the enforcers had fled the country, hiding under new identities in Spain or the Netherlands. Others whispered darker stories that they had been caught in Manchester and executed in the most brutal way possible. No one knew for sure, and that uncertainty became a weapon in itself. Fear grew, shaping behavior and dictating choices in ways Doyle had never anticipated. Doyle's network began to fray. Enforcers who had once followed orders without hesitation now hesitated, questioning their own safety. Debt collectors moved slower, more cautious, scanning streets for shadows, scanning alleys for unexpected movements. The absence of Mason and Riley left a hole in the gang's operations, but more importantly, it left a gap in its aura of intimidation. Doyle had relied on the reputation of the two men to keep rivals in check. Without them, the balance of power was fragile, and enemies sensed opportunity. Meanwhile, the scrapyard where Mason and Riley had met their end remained untouched, almost sacred in its secrecy. Locals noticed the strange quiet that hung over the area, a silence that felt unnatural. The surrounding streets seemed emptier at night, with only occasional passers-by daring to move near the perimeter. Stories circulated among the working-class communities nearby. Tales of screams in the darkness, of shadows moving where no one should have been, of the unmistakable smell of smoke that lingered long after the flames had gone. Even the scrapyard workers who passed through during the day avoided speaking of what had happened. Fear silenced them as effectively as any threat could. Police investigations were inconclusive. Anonymous tips hinted that something terrible had occurred, that Doyle's enforcers were missing under suspicious circumstances. Officers scoured the scrapyard, searching for clues, but found only burnt debris, twisted metal, and patches of scorched ground. No bodies were recovered, no DNA traces could be identified. Without concrete evidence, no charges could be filed, no arrests made. The case remained unsolved, leaving an air of mystery that only fueled gossip. In the underworld, unsolved disappearances were almost as powerful as public executions. They reminded everyone that the rules could change without warning, and that even the strongest could vanish. Among rival gangs, Mason and Riley's disappearance became a cautionary tale. Stories exaggerated over time that the enforcers had been tied, beaten, and burned alive, that their bodies had been buried beneath rusting cars and concrete rubble. Each retelling added a layer of horror, making the story grow in legend. Within Doyle's organization, trust eroded. Members became paranoid, constantly checking for signs of betrayal. Fear permeated every interaction, and the streets of Birmingham and Manchester grew more tense. For the general public, unaware of the full details, Mason and Riley simply disappeared. For those in the criminal underworld, however, the silence around the scrapyard spoke volumes. The burnt and buried enforcers became symbols of the ultimate consequences of crossing the wrong people, and their absence reshaped the dynamics of gangland crime. Power, it seemed, was fleeting, and reputation alone could not protect even the most feared figures. Years passed, but the story of Mason and Riley did not fade. In the criminal underworld, their fate became a cautionary tale, a grim lesson passed down from one gang member to another. Even those who had never met the enforcers knew their names, whispered in fear during meetings and over drinks in darkened pubs. The details became almost mythic. The way they had been lured into Manchester, the precision of the ambush, the fire that consumed them, and the careful burial beneath the scrapyard rubble. To outsiders it was a story of brutal crime, but to those in gangland, it was a symbol of how quickly power could vanish. Doyle himself was not immune to the consequences of the incident. With Mason and Riley gone, his network of enforcers weakened, and rivals began to encroach on his territory. The fear that had once secured his authority dissipated, replaced by caution and suspicion. Every new shipment, every debt collection, now carried a heightened risk. Associates questioned his decisions more openly, and minor slights that might have been ignored in the past became sources of tension and paranoia. Doyle's empire, built on intimidation and fear, began to fracture quietly, but unmistakably. The scrapyard in Manchester remained untouched for years. It became a symbol of terror, a landmark in gangland. Local residents avoided it at night, sensing something was not right, and even the police treated it cautiously. Unable to confirm the full story, but aware that violence had once erupted there. Among criminals, it was known simply as the graveyard, a place where even the strongest could be brought low. Mason and Riley's fate taught a brutal lesson. In gangland, loyalty, reputation and strength could all be destroyed in a single night. Despite their disappearance, their legend influenced gang culture across the Midlands. Younger enforcers learned from their story, internalizing the fear that even those at the top were vulnerable. The tale became a tool of control. Veteran criminals would recount it to remind others that one misstep could mean death. Mason and Riley, once hunters of fear, had been turned into symbols, their violent reputations transformed into a cautionary tale more powerful than any public beating or shooting. Their deaths left a vacuum, but the void they created carried weight far beyond their lives. Even Doyle's enemies learned from the events. Rival gangs recognized the consequences of underestimating their opponents, and the careful planning that had eliminated Mason and Riley became a blueprint for strategic revenge and territorial control. Violence was no longer just a tool, it was theater, politics and warning all at once. The burned and buried enforcers became part of an unspoken code, a story repeated to establish order through fear. In the end, Mason and Riley's lives and deaths underscored the fragile nature of power in gangland Britain. No matter how feared, how violent, or how cunning, they had been vulnerable to forces they could not control. The streets of Birmingham and Manchester would continue to hum with illicit trades and quiet violence, but the memory of the enforcers who had walked into a trap and never returned would linger, a stark reminder that in the underworld, survival was never guaranteed, and even the strongest could be extinguished in an instant.